Maybe, Berta, I just love listening to you. Maybe you could talk, I'm looking at 2 sentences that I wrote down from our lunch. And one was the conspiracy of hope, and just sort of the idea that a lot of what we're talking about in this movement is about helping people have hope and sort of sharing that. So do you want to talk about that for a second? And then one other thing I want to bring up to your attention. Go ahead.
Well, the conspiracy of hope is a piece of writing that Pat Deegan did, which was very influential to me when I started getting involved in the recovery movement. And the way it fits in with Hearing Voices Network is that hope is a belief. And my coming to Hearing Voices Network movement was learning about belonging, that developing a small community where people respected and cared about one another, and believing, having a hope that we could make lives of meaning and purpose with any explanation that we wanted, and becoming. We became stronger, and then we would take that strength into the wider community and not just be tolerated, but we'd contribute to building something more compassionate and more just, because we had, many of us, accepted being less than and subordinate to those who knew best. And what we were able to do was to build something in this space between us. And it's based a lot on curiosity, which is an openness of heart and mind. And I think curiosity is the first, it leads to love. And what I really experienced in the Hearing Voices Network movement was the opportunity to love. Human to human, to love each other into wholeness.
Another phrase that you use that sort of dovetails nicely with what you just said was the idea of mutually created sacred space, and the idea that it's, so I want you to just talk about that. Like, what is that? Where does it come from? What is that about?
In a Hearing Voices group, we acknowledge that every voice matters, whether it's coming from a person or it's a person who hears a voice that nobody else hears. So we develop mutually what makes the space most trustworthy. And that becomes, it can become sacred space. And what it means is that the facilitator is a member of the group and no more important or wise than anyone else, but perhaps a good listener to help people trust the wisdom that they already have.
And you and I had talked about, you mentioned the word curiosity, but you also talked to me about the fact that it takes some courage to step into that, and a little bit of risk, because sometimes it's messy and we don't always know where those conversations are going to go. But when we create it well enough and we're all in it, then it's okay that it's messy, because we all have a responsibility. That's the other word that you used with me before, was that we all have a responsibility to that space, to protect it.
I have to say that I messed up a lot. I learned a lot from trying and not doing it as well as I wished, because I was learning alongside everyone else. And one of the things I learned was to respect the fears that I had and that others had, and to be able to name them and share that responsibility. I think that when I was growing up, I thought to be brave was to admit no weakness. And so I didn't learn much because I was such a toughie, because I was so vulnerable. And what I learned in peer support and then in Hearing Voices Network groups was to step into my vulnerability and get to know my fear and accept it. And what helped me do that was the other members of the group. It wasn't, back with that psychologist in the 70s, I could talk about being afraid, but I didn't have that shared space of equality to live into that, some of what was very terrorizing and messy. And so the courage was really to just accept my vulnerability. And that's when I became convinced that I was human. When I started doing those groups, I still got blood tests and looked to see what the lab report said, because I still didn't believe I was human. I could have my foot in two different worlds and I could talk. I'm a talker, but in my guts, I didn't believe I was human. And that's one of the things that people in Montgomery County basically loved me into embodying, really believing in my human beingness.
Thank you. We need to move into getting some group response, but I want to give you a minute, maybe 2 minutes. We have really long lunches, by the way. They clear the table, but they're great. Just sort of, as you think about how far this movement has come, you've talked about your journey, you've talked a little bit about the movement, sort of when you look on the horizon, what is an aspiration or a dream that you would aspire for us as a group?
Well, for one thing, it's the freedom to explore, because this is a dynamic process, and it's everybody's vision that will create the future. And initially, I thought that a Hearing Voices Network group could only be a group with people with lived experience of hearing voices facilitated by a voice hearer. And I really believed that was going to be that way forever. I still think that that's an extremely important space to nurture. And I also think that when people find their power, they can take that to many other settings and tables, and that we really can be a force for restoring sanity in our culture, so that we have a different relationship to dominance. I used to feel that I had to be subordinate to these dominant beliefs of the experts and of my voices, and I don't feel that way anymore. But I do think that I don't know where it's going to lead us, but if we do it by listening to each other and with respect for difference, that we can help to humanize the neighborhoods we live in.